For those who don't know me, I'm Helen, part of the team, St Bride's and other churches around. Right, today is the last in our series of favourite Bible passages. And you may be thinking, strange passages that Helen chose. But actually, I've not chosen my favourite. I've been different. I've chosen a challenging, but I think also a playful parable. And before I talk about the passage, I want to explain why. I considered a few favourite passages, learnt in my earlier life, in my evangelical days. But I was then aware that my relationship with the Bible has changed since then. I've moved from a certain literal reading of a divine product to a more historical and metaphorical reading of the Bible. Yet it's more than that. And I was struggling to find the words to express that. And I'm sure, I know many of you understand that. But then I read a summary of Richard Rohr's daily meditations this week. I thought, yeah, he says it better than I can. And he writes about Scripture offering us an intimate relationship, a dark journey, a path where we must discover for ourselves that grace, love, mercy and forgiveness are absolutely necessary for survival in an uncertain world. So, the passage. But why a parable? Well, I was introduced to the playfulness of parables during a wonderful, fun, 3-day godly play course that Guy very kindly said, yeah, go to Edinburgh, it's a wonderful place, and go and do it. And one of the aspects of the Bible we were looking at and helping us to explain Bible in a playful way with children, but it also can be used with anyone who has different learning styles, whether they're old or young, learning disabilities, anything. And I was really struck by the fun way of approaching a parable. Just hang on. I need something to help me here. And sort of hunt and seek, but I know, there's something here that's going to help. What is this? Something here. A box. A very old box. It's got a lid. Can I open it? Oh, it's hard. It's hard to get in. It's a bit like a parable. And it's a bit like a treasure chest. Every time you look at it, you find something different. But there is something in it. And I wonder what that can be. Something beautiful. I could use it as a cloth, for a table, for a feast. Or I could wear it round me, dress up. I can play with it. I can dress up, dressing up in boxes. Every child loves this. You can play, you can make it something of what it is. So the parable. This parable that I've chosen. Why this passage? And this was as a result of another bit of training that I did when I did a module on the introduction to the New Testament. And I know I've only just had a tiny wee bit, and I'd sort of love to do more, really. I welcomed the opportunity to learn more, and was excited to hear of new insights by theologians related to archaeological discoveries and the study of ancient texts. And when we were looking at the Gospels, I found this passage in Matthew really disturbing, because I was familiar with the slightly shorter version of the parable in Luke that doesn't have the nasty bit at the end about the chap being chucked away because he wasn't wearing his proper robe. And I remember sort of having quite an argument with my tutor. And then when we had to the assignment and we had to choose to do an in-depth study, an exegesis, and I said, I don't know what to do. And he challenged me to do this passage. So challenging, a challenging passage, and then looking at it furthermore, I could get so much more out of it. And I want to share with you now something of what I learnt from that passage. I'm sorry you don't have copies of text in front of you, actually, but I'll tell the story and sort of we'll get there. I think this parable is all about inclusive invitations, which is excellent, wonderful for us here at St. Bride's. But they're given to share the joys of the kingdom, but the main thing is they need to be fully accepted. If we have an invitation and we don't fully accept it, it's who suffers? We do, because we don't go to the party. But in the passage, what disturbs me, and I guess yourselves too, it's violent and disturbing images of destruction, exclusion. And I thought, well, actually, I don't want to go to that banquet if that's the way the host behaves. Is that then what the kingdom of heaven is like? Maybe not. I'll look at the parable in more detail later, but a bit of context so we can imagine the scene. So this passage comes in Matthew's Gospel after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which we remember on Palm Sunday. Then we have all the turbulent scenes in the temple when Jesus angrily removes the money changers from the temple. Scenes full of controversy and high emotions. And then, of course, the chief priests and the elders, they're challenging Jesus' authority. And Jesus responds in his wonderful way with two parables. First of all, in the Bible we have there the parable of the two sons and then the wicked tenants. And they realise that actually through this parable Jesus is speaking about them and they don't like it. They want to arrest him but fear the crowd of supporters who regard Jesus as a prophet. Then, this is the bit in the Bible where this, in Matthew's Gospel, where this parable comes. It's a parable about the kingdom of God with similar sort of relational themes of king, father and son. Then after the parable, the Pharisees plot to trap Jesus into saying the wrong thing. They do not like what Jesus says, and I'm sure he knows it. So that's sort of what was happening then. But the writer, Matthew, a Jew, he most likely wrote this about between 70 and 100 years later. 70 and 100 CE, more than 40 years after Jesus' death. And it was important, as it was we know for the early writers, to record things, to record the words and deeds of their new leader of the early church, so others could hear the stories. And the early Christian communities, they were struggling to define their identity as they moved away from their origins in Judaism. They were persecuted terribly and suffered physical violence for their faith. The parables of Jesus, therefore, would have felt very different to them as they heard them in first century Palestine, less shocking than as now. It was a time of violence, evil tyrants and kings. But hang on, isn't that what's happening today? Has anything changed in terms of evil tyrants as kings? Whatever we may think about our government here, and its policies, at least we don't live, most of us don't live in such scary places, war-torn parts of the Middle East, Africa, and other parts of the world. But violence, emotional violence, physical violence affect us all. In the home, local community, and the wider world. And it was last week, Mark was talking about the majority of crime takes place in homes. And people are excluded, as we all know, for who they are, for their age, their race, their health, their ability, their status, their gender and their sexual orientation. We fear being excluded and can possibly recall times, and I can certainly, in our lives when that's happened to us, whether it's as a child, playground, and you're the last one picked to be in a team, or someone says, I don't want you coming to my party. You know, those feelings stay with us, exclusion. And in a way, maybe this makes us reluctant to accept invitations. We don't like to be rejected. We don't like to be excluded. Are we going to be accepted for who we are? And of course, in our church community here, that is what we are really so good at, I believe. But we can always try more. Acceptance for people for who they are. Back to the parable. So we have just a sort of summary of the sequence of the events. The king gives out invitations to the wedding banquet of his son, but the guests don't come. Therefore we then have an image of an empty wedding hall, food all waiting. Then, after a reminder from the king's slaves, some of the guests respond violently and murder the slaves. The king reacts violently. He orders destruction and burning of the city. Then he commands his servants to invite everyone from the local streets, good and bad, an inclusive invitation to all. Love reached out and met people where they were. And then, that horrible bit, in stark contrast, the king orders violent punishment for one guest at the wedding banquet who is not wearing a wedding robe. But we don't have an image of a bridegroom or a bride. They're not mentioned. I thought they're rather important in a wedding banquet somehow. Let's listen again and hear a bit of an interpretation as suggested in various commentaries. The king extends invitations. The king in the parable is God. His son is Jesus. The royal wedding feast is the banquet of the kingdom. After the group of the king's slaves, they were murdered, the sending of the servants is the sending of God's messengers. Murder of the prophets, murder of Jesus. The king responds violently. Then he commands his servants to invite everyone. Again, we get that beautiful bit there of love reaching out and meeting people where they were. But this violent punishment for not wearing a robe. Why did the king condemn to death a man who was not wearing a wedding robe? What's significant about this robe? In this parable, the robe is a metaphor. It has a deeper meaning. It's more than just something nice to wear to go to a wedding. The parable suggests the guests did not need a wedding robe to be invited, but they needed one to stay. The custom was, those days, that the host provided wedding robes for the guests. It's been a very wealthy host. The robe was freely given. This might well suggest that the excluded guest sneaked in through the back door, ignored the king, the welcome line, and came in that way. Or maybe all of them possibly in a different way, were expected to have come dressed and ready. The academics, the theologians still debate it. But what does this mean for us here and now? I think the act of putting a garment on, being clothed, is a metaphor for adopting a new way of life. When putting a new garment on, we need to remove the old one so we can put on the new one. We are invited to clothe ourselves in readiness for God's kingdom. The invitation from God is freely given. We need to fully respond. Simple. There is a warning in the parable for those who may ignore doing what God requires, both for individuals and the church. Those who do not clothe themselves with a new garment, adopt a new way of life, will be excluded from the kingdom of heaven. Now, in our first reading, Colossians, it talks about, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness and patience. It's the fruits of the Spirit of grace which we are asked to wear, to show in our Christian lives. This goes for us as individuals and the church as a Christian community. So I think here, summary, the parable of the wedding banquet is about the kingdom of heaven, the coming of God's kingdom, the arrival of the Messiah. God's kingdom is here and now, in which love and justice and truth and mercy reign. They are the robes which we need for the wedding. If we refuse to put them on, then we are saying that we don't want to stay at the party. We are the ones excluding ourselves. We need to put on the robes of love, justice, truth and mercy to show we've fully accepted the invitation. What does it mean? I'm sure you've got loads of ideas. I'm just sort of summarising something here, and then possibly if there's time for a bit of a conversation. Yeah, okay. As individuals, and it doesn't, justice, people think, oh, that's always being an activist and doing big walks and protesting with banners. Not everyone is the same, and we're not all activists. Some of us show our love and our justice, truth and mercy in a quieter, possibly unseen sort of way to others. But as individuals, it's befriending someone who's very different to you, being there when someone needs support, campaigning on an issue of justice, becoming politically active. And as church, well, yesterday said it all really, I think, opening wide the doors for others in the community to use the facilities, to share what we have here. Use the facilities. I mean, all the different groups that come in here during the week, the Hope Plus, the Red Cross, Meringue. But the caring, the creativity yesterday, not to mention the cakes with the music, was just brilliant. And so many people. So I invite you now to just have a chat with people near to you. From your point of view, what do you think it means to put on love, justice, truth and mercy? Okay?